I don't know where you are on this. Do you need some lunch?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Fine.
Yep.
And we begin part 3 in our current series of programs called Our Little Corner, having to do with recreating and revisiting the Battle of Plattsburgh and the War of 1812. It happened on September 11th, 1814, and here we are on November 21st in 1999, right off the gym floor in the gymnasium at the Recreation Center on what was the new base, former Plattsburgh Air Force Base. This is something that's never been done in this gym before and probably will never be done in the future. An artist by the name of Dean Mosier has taken it as a lifelong work, I would guess, to do massive paintings of several battles. And so he's done this before in other venues. The last one he did was in another place entirely, the Battle of Lake Erie, also in the War of 1812. But as part of this whole dream of establishing a new, huge interpretive center on the former old base near the old stone barracks in Plattsburgh, Dean Mosier decided to bring his show to Plattsburgh. And with him, a group of established experts on not only this battle but other naval battles in history. We have people who sail boats, we have underwater archaeologists, we have people who've done a great deal of study and written books on maritime battles, including the Battle of Plattsburgh. With all those people here, they started on November 20th at 9 o'clock in the morning. We were the first here at 8:30 to greet them. And we spent the entire weekend watching them after they built a huge grid across the entire gym floor with the light blue, actually the land masses, and the white with all the blue stripes and various other arrows and designations, which is the Plattsburgh Bay, recreating minute by minute in 10-minute segments what happened on September 11th, starting early in the morning, and ended up in an American victory which turned the tide and meant the end of the war. The Battle of Plattsburgh, fought on September 11th. So Dean Mosier's idea is to get all the experts here, get their input, rewrite history, and try to get a consensus about how this battle played out, taking a lot of photographs, including the documentary that we're doing here on Hometown Cable for Our Little Corner, and then picking a scene and doing a huge photograph of it. You're looking at the Battle of Flamborough Head, 9:45 p.m., September 23rd, 1779. Amazing. It looks like there are lights on inside that burning ship. He's done this several times before, and you can see what he's done. He's going to come back in December. They're going to actually build a mock deck of one of the ships, get some actors to dress up, and take more photographs before he actually decides to begin his historic paintings. We're going to talk to him a little bit more about what's going to happen and what the process is involved. We hope to have this beautiful, huge painting of the Battle of Plattsburgh presented at the time for September 11th, 2000. You look at some of these pictures of the Confiance, the U.S. Eagle, and various other boats that were here. And imagine how we are actually creating history ourselves. You're looking at copies of old maps from that precise time period. A great deal is known about the Battle of Plattsburgh. A great deal has been written about the Battle of Plattsburgh, but how accurate was this information? As we've said in our 2 previous programs, a great deal of the information written down about these battles comes out of a court-martial, which occurred after the Battle of Plattsburgh and after the War of 1812. And the British accounts of the battle were skewed by the fact that they wanted to make the people conducting the court-martial believe that they were shot on by the shore batteries. As we've proven here today in a very graphic way, the ships were far outside the range of the shore batteries along Plattsburgh. So that wasn't even a factor. So we've had to adjust the information that we've received from these books. We have arrived hopefully at a consensus based on the opinions of all the experts that were here, and we had several resident experts, and we had a lot of local people stop in to give their input. Captain Frank Pabst, for example, was one of them. Various other people have sailed this lake for years, have been more. We're at an interim time period now at about 1:15 on a Sunday afternoon, November 21st. Shortly after 1 o'clock, members of the community will come in. We'll run through the demonstration and tell people what the consensus is of what I say we, collectively, this group of experts has discovered by putting replicas on this grid, on this gym floor, do the demonstrations, and then entertain questions that people might have. Hopefully, it'll be a learning experience not only for the experts, but certainly for those people who come here. There'll be several ways of documenting it. Some still photographs have been taken. Some videotape has been taken throughout the weekend. The local media will be doing their news stories, and this edition of our little corner in a 3-part series hopefully will be a nice piece of history for people to view for many, many decades to come. And our dream, Calvin's dream and mine, is not to make a lot of money off of these things, but to make it as a piece of history so that sometime people 20 or 30 years from now, viewing that then completed interpretive center on former original portion of Plattsburgh Air Force Base, can view this and say, wow, this took some energy and some foresight back in 1999 to get these people together and to use that great facility on the old base to put all these models down and find out little by little, minute by minute, how the Battle of Plattsburgh was fought. So that's what we hope to accomplish, and we hope you stick with us, because we'll have our 1 o'clock question and answer period and demonstration to culminate what we think is a pretty exciting weekend for our little corner. Well, here's a guy who's been involved in studying the history of Lake Champlain in this area for a long time. Local businessman, artisan, and just general good guy.
Retired businessman, Gordy.
Kit Booth, how are you?
I'm great, Gordy. Thank you.
Here's the guy who laid the paper down. So you were here from the beginning.
On my hands and knees most of Thursday and part of Friday, yeah. Yeah, it was interesting, but I felt it on Saturday, believe me, with muscles I hadn't used.
But you know, we are blessed. We are truly blessed to have this as part of our overall dream, to focus on the history of this area and the Battle of Plattsburgh, to have a guy like Dean Mosier and these experts come to town and join us in a former recreation center on the airbase. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's very exciting, because these folks are probably the top experts on this battle that are in existence. And if they can come to some kind of a consensus of how it really happened, well, then we've got the true story that we can tell on our weekend in September.
It was so much fun for us to walk around behind them and just eavesdrop on their conversations yesterday, and the sparks were almost flying. One guy would say something and the other guy would say, no, I don't think so, because the wind was. And then our good friend Captain Frank Pabst came in and gave his 2 cents on how deep the water was at that period of time. And as we get all finished with this whole thing, I mean, the process for Calvin and me was just almost more than we could handle. So we decided to stick around and make a 3-part series
Absolutely.
out of it.
Well, I'm sure you're going to be having a lot of fun just going back and looking at all this again to see what you really saw and to try and absorb it all, because I imagine there's an awful lot of detail that is hard to absorb the first time you hear it, isn't there?
Oh, there certainly is. We've all read the popular accounts of the Battle of Plattsburgh.
Right.
And there are discrepancies in almost all of them, especially between the ones written from the American perspective and the ones written from the British perspective.
I'm sure there are.
So the reason for setting out this grid and have these people talk about it is to, as you said, come up with a consensus of what we think may be closer to the facts. There are some things about the Battle of Plattsburgh, based on our interviews over the last 2 days, some things that we'll never know.
Really?
Precisely how many anchors were out at certain times, when the anchors, precisely when certain anchors were shot off.
Or cut.
And so we can speculate. But as I said before, we've got the experts here that can say, no, look at, based on where we think this ship was at this time, maybe this is what happened to the anchor.
Right. We can come as close as possible, at least, to the truth.
So you know, it's a learning process because, as we've said many times since we began this series yesterday, we didn't have CNN around. We didn't have Calvin Castine and Hometown Cable around, so we had to base
He
it
probably
on-
would have been out there, wouldn't he, in a bateau, filming this.
he would have been there, and he'd have made me row, too.
You know, but to pinpoint this, finding that Confiance anchor is just fantastic.
Well,
I suppose it did put a lot of boats into position that they didn't quite know where they were originally.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That is where they started yesterday.
Is it? Mm-hmm.
These people walked out there, and Bill Van Stockman walked out there and said, "See this right down here between my feet? That's where the anchor was." And the guy
Okay.
said, "Oh,
Okay, then that's where the
okay."
Confiance had to
And
be.
that's where it had to be because, you know, somebody didn't pull that thing up and take it there. That's where it
No,
landed.
no, it's 3,000 pounds, and it didn't drift in or out, did it, once it dropped? It
And
stayed
some
there.
of these people have had a look at it. They've gone over to the Maritime Museum
Oh, they did?
to take a look at it to see what it looks like, to get an idea precisely which anchor it was, because it's important to know on the Confiance what two anchors were shot off, whether they were both on the same side or one on each side, and where did the shot come from to make the marks that it made on that anchor. So we do, you know, it's really, as Calvin said, unbelievable to have real, tangible evidence. And that anchor is tangible
Absolutely.
evidence
Yeah,
because
sure
you
it
can
is.
see where it was hit. So this is the
And
kind
where
of
it
thing
dropped.
we've done here this weekend, and this isn't the end of the story. This is, for you and me and Calvin and the rest, this is just the beginning.
That's right, that's right. And now we have a little better story to tell on the weekend this fall.
Well,
on the
listen.
year 2000. Hey, you know, we're really working on that already, Gordy. We've got at least 6 new things coming up this year compared to what we had last year, and we're going to have all the same things as we had last year as well. Each year we're trying to build it. We're going to double the budget this year. It's really amazing. And the new ideas keep coming out. We have the most enthusiastic committee, but we're talking about this, not about the weekend right now, aren't we?
Well, we're talking about the whole thing because
But the weekend is important to me.
it's a
'cause
package.
our
It's a
committee's
package,
been
and it's
working on it.
the whole thing is very important to Calvin and me as well as you. And this will fit in, and
You bet.
because listen, by September 11th, 2000, we're going to have this painting that all of this works up to. The whole reason for this weekend is for a dean to create a painting that's going to be glorious.
That we can show to the president
That
when
we-
he or she comes, right?
Of course, when he or she comes. You like that idea, don't you?
Well, we just don't know what her name is yet.
I love it. Kit, thanks for being with us today.
You're welcome.
It's always
my
great
pleasure.
to talk to you.
I can't wait to hear what they have to say today.
A fanfare, we don't have trumpets, but we really ought to. And invite you all to take a comfortable seat and let you know that at any point during the presentation this afternoon, unless we ask you otherwise at the time, you're welcome to get up and walk around on the floor to get a better view. The scholars and those who are going out on the floor on the paper will take their shoes off. We're here this afternoon for a truly historic event. There won't be any cannon fire, there won't be any guns, there won't be any bugles, but we're going to see history recreated here. And we're going to see it in a way that no one in 185 years since the actual battle has seen it. Those of us here today are going to learn things that no one, not even the most eminent scholars of the 19th century and the early 20th century, have known, have written, or have said. Just think about that for a minute. The scholars I'm going to introduce you to today came here at the request of an artist whose goal is to paint a picture of the Battle of Plattsburgh as accurate as any ever painted before. And to get to that point where he can say, this is what it really looked like, we had to do all this and bring in people from all across the country to help him. I'm going to introduce them in just a minute, but I'm also going to invite you to take note if you have a question. There'll be ample time this afternoon for questions. It's the whole point of inviting the public to this event, is not to let you see a show and then leave scratching your head wondering I didn't understand that, but to raise your hand. We're all friendly, informative, and we want to help you. You ask a question, there's no such thing as a question that's uninformed. There's no such thing as a dumb question. We're all looking back 185 years into the past. Out here before you, on my right, is Plattsburgh Bay. Some of us know how to read maps. Some of us have a little challenge when we read maps. So let me orient you a little bit. The blue insulation board is the land. The white paper is the water. Over here beyond the tables is Crab Island. Up here is the outline of Cumberland Head. And over there, near the blue, what do we call those, cushions on the wall, is the village of Plattsburgh. As I said before, you're welcome to get up and walk around and look more closely. And in between is the water on which was fought the greatest battle of the War of 1812. You're going to see on this side ships that are roughly this size. When we get to the actual engagement where the two fleets are firing at one another, we're going to move your attention over here to a square mile of water that represents the area where the battle took place. And there we'll be using larger models because the scale will be closer in. And you'll be able to see the fleets, some of the ships right here. Today's scholars benefit from facts and information that, as I said, were never before available, including the exact location of the anchor found in 1997, verified to be one of the two anchors lost from the British flagship Confiance. With that information put on this map, the scholars yesterday completely revised the location of the battle and the travel of the British fleet from Cumberland Head to the battle line. That anchor never moved, folks. That was 3,500 pounds of iron. When that went down, it stayed put. And today, thanks to the global positioning satellite and the presence of mind of Ken and Bill Van Stockham, when they found it to take a GPS coordinate, we know exactly where that was. That's new information. With experts in wind and sail, we've seen, and we'll see today, proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the British fleet could not have sailed farther north in Plattsburgh Bay than they did, given the prevailing wind conditions. You're going to hear some very interesting things. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you, those of you who haven't met, the artist, Dean Mosier of Fairhope, Alabama, who is about to paint the fourth in his series of 5 epic-size mural paintings of the 5 greatest moments in naval history in the age of sail. He'll tell you about his project, and he'll introduce the scholars. For those of you who don't have the 2 handouts, we'll have somebody bring them by. Anybody not have both handouts? Could someone help us out here by taking the 2 handouts, the one that says the scholars, and the other one that has the date on it, and make sure everyone has one of these? These folks came here from all over the country. They're the leading scholars in the world on this battle, and you deserve to know all you can about them. So if you'd raise your hands, those of you who don't have them, let's get those distributed. Your experience will be much more meaningful with that. We also want to thank Bill and Ken Van Stockham, as I mentioned, and also Captain Frank Pabst of the MV Juniper, all 3 of whom provided valuable technical assistance during yesterday's session. And of course, we've got to thank, before we begin, the people who made the materials possible. Our sponsors for this event today, including the Battle of Plattsburgh Association, are the International Paper Company. All this paper you see here was milled in Ticonderoga, put on rolls and shipped up here at no cost to the conference by IP. The blue foam board was provided at no cost to the conference by Ward Lumber Company. And this building, the technical assistance, the power, the heat, the lights, and a whole lot of support that you can't see today was provided by the Plattsburgh Air Base Redevelopment Corporation and President Dan Winnicky and his staff. So I'd urge you to give those sponsors a big hand as I turn it over to Dean Mosher.
Thank you so much for coming out. It's not often you get to go to a tie and no shoes event. My grandfather has a saying that your friends are people that know all about you and still like you, which I've always liked. And I have to say that these aren't just scholars, they're friends. They had to be. Each one of them has schedules that are unbelievably busy. They've given their time to come here just to participate in this process. In the case of Jim Bradford, this is the third time he's worked with me on a project, and he's a driving force and believes in what's being done here. Walter has worked with me on, this is the second project of its type. Jerry, this is the second, and David has just found out about how this whole process, but I think he likes it. When you're painting a picture, when you want to paint a picture, you can say, well, I want to do a really good version, and you start writing to scholars. And you say, well, what do you think about this? And they'll write back, or you'll email, and you'll start getting a communication going. And you get their opinions on things, and you mix that with your own opinion, and you paint a picture. Well, you can get pretty accurate that way, but you don't really start to get the synergy or anywhere near the amount of information when you start gathering people together on site and start seeing all the incredible amounts of data that they have regarding this and their knowledge and practical experience start coalescing based on the eyewitness and the factual-based data. Factual-based data. Say that 10 times fast. With this, we're very fortunate to have enough fixed positions, eyewitness accounts, times, and other information to be able to loosely start putting it together and then start honing in on the center. And if you were here at all yesterday, you saw that for about 9 hours yesterday, we started at a given point with the fixed positions, with the knowledge of the weather, and we just systematically moved in, moved around, slightly changed, honed in, and finally came up with a solution or configuration that fits like a glove. Everything works in regards to a consensus way of looking at all the information. I believe that's as close as it gets. Now, before we start on the battle, I would like to introduce the gentlemen that have been so instrumental in making this come together. I'm just the artist. I'm in search of the truth. And this is as close to the truth as you can possibly get. I'll start with Jim Bradford on the end, the one with the tie. Jim is a professor at Texas A&M. He taught at the United States Naval Academy for 10 years, from 79 to 89?
73.
To 83, okay. He started when he was 12 years old, teaching at the Naval Academy. And he has either written or contributed to approximately 16 volumes for the United States Naval Institute Press, considered by many, and certainly considered by me, to be the finest general naval historian in the United States. And I won't let him argue with it. Next to him is Walter Ripka, who is captain, sailing master of the brig Niagara, which is based out of Erie. Walter is the foremost authority, by acknowledgement of everyone I've ever talked to, of sailing vessels of this era. He also has a tremendous experience of the War of 1812 and the battles that were fought, including this one. Invaluable. Jerry Altaw, standing next to him. Jerry has written 3 books on the War of 1812 era. He co-authored A Signal Victory for the Naval Institute Press, that won the John Lehman Award in 1998 for Best Historical Work, which is pretty prestigious, by the way. And then Colonel Fitzends, I know you know, has spent incredible amounts of time and resources to gather together an incredibly comprehensive view of what went on. His search for the truth is tremendous, and his dedication to bringing these facts to light is without equal. And I'd like to thank him very much for the time that he's given. I'd also like to thank up front so many of you who have come and helped us roll out paper, kit. Thank you so much. Bill Rowe and his wife Bunny, who have been wonderful. Everyone who has come to help, participate, and been so kind in this whole process. Thank you very much. I'd also very, very much like to thank Chris, because Chris's vision and understanding what it takes to get the community involved to bring forward the vision of how Plattsburgh can truly understand and communicate that to visitors about the battle, and the vision of the base and the interpretive center is magnificent. And I hope you'll give him every help with that. And I know he's working with you on that also. But it's a wonderful idea. It's an incredible overview of what this community can be and needs to be, and hopefully will be. And that's what a part of this is. I'm boiling this all down to be just one painting, a huge overview and a portrait of McDonough, because it was the character and leadership of McDonough at that moment in history that changed American history forever. The rest of this is to help me get an overview of what's going on. But when this is over, it's a gift. This whole process of recreating this, using the best people in the world who have given their time to do so, is a gift to this community and research for the future to use as a base, because we've put together something that's extremely special, and it's all to help this process and this vision. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Walter, who's going to tell you about the vessel's approach and up to the battle, and then we've got a demonstration here about the anchor, and then we'll move on to this. Now, Chris did an eloquent job of explaining what we've done here. To get the whole bay in here, we had to do this at a scale where you could include all of the battle area and the approach area and the shoal water and all the things that played a factor. On the opposite side over there, where those represent the British batteries and the American batteries, and the outside arcs there are calibrated to show you where the effective range of the guns were in case the British had overrun, because that was very much a factor in the court-martial. They said had the British overrun the American positions and they had started to fire, that they would have been able to sort of enfilade the ships on either side. Well, that isn't the case. But all of that has been laid out for you to look and ask questions about, and I think you'll find that quite interesting. Over here is the battle area. And you'll notice a lot of similarity between the lines there and the placement of the ships here at 1/96 scale, which is approximately 4 times the size of what we have here. So if I haven't confused you enough, we'll get into the rest of the program. But thank you so much for everything, for coming out, and for caring about your history. With that, I introduce Captain Walter Ridgway.
Are you? Hearing me clearly now? Does this work? Everybody's got that? All right. I work for the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission based in Erie, Pennsylvania at the Erie Maritime Museum. The Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission maintains a square-rigged ship, the Niagara, which is a reconstruction of a ship that was built in Lake Erie, fought in the Battle of Lake Erie in 1813, and that ship is operated 4 to 5 months of the year as a living history project, so it's been my privilege to sail that vessel. I've learned a great deal from it.
and that's given me a more chance than most people have the opportunity of studying the sailing and hailing characteristics of these vessels. Before we get into the movements of the battle, in order to help make sense out of it, what some of the limitations were, I thought we'd take a couple of minutes to talk about some of the limitations that are on a square-rig sailing ship. And this could be a whole afternoon session. It's going to be 5 minutes, so this is the real quick once-over of it. But the key thing that you have to keep in mind is that for any sailing vessel, they can use the wind, but the direction they cannot go is directly to where the wind is blowing from. Now, on a modern sailboat, if this is the wind direction coming out of the north, the point of these scissors, you will be maybe 45 degrees off on either side. That's a 90-degree arc you don't get to use without zigzagging your way back and forth, tacking. With a vessel like these, even if you swing the yards around, and these models don't let them swing quite as far as they really can on an actual vessel, but if you brace the yards sharp up, catch the wind and the sails on the backside of the yards, you can do better than 90 degrees off the wind, but not by a lot. The highest up you will point towards the wind is about 65, 67 degrees away from it. Then, as you go ahead, the vessel will also slide sideways a little bit. And in the case of some of these vessels that had to be built shallow for the waters they had to work and didn't have a lot of keel under them, they're going to slide a lot. It's called leeway. So what that works out to is that the ability of these ships to get to windward, where the wind was coming from, was very, very limited. If you take 67 off the wind and then throw in another 11, 12, 15 degrees of leeway, the course you're actually going to make good relative to the wind is about 80 degrees away from it. You're barely holding your own. So these vessels could do better than just sail downwind, and some of them that had more keel and body could do a better job getting up to windward. But the Confiance, the principal British vessel, very shoal draft relative to the rig on her, very little capability for getting to windward. Now that's a key factor, because on that factor, the rest of this battle tends to hinge on that. So, with that much said, and I'll come back here to talk about anchoring in a few minutes, but keep in mind that that's their biggest limitation from where they're starting out. Now, I'm going to leave these here, even though they're a bit in the way, and go back to talk about the overview of this action, and then we'll come back here and talk about anchoring, and then we'll look at the actual fighting in detail, moving these scale models over there. So let me back up to the morning of the battle. I'm still going to need to go back to anchors. Okay. Early in the morning, in the dark hours, the British fleet gets underway from their base. They have a north wind. The day before it was blowing out of the south. They couldn't move. Now the wind's blowing out of the north. They can come down and advance. They can also stop their ships, pointing them up to the wind, feathering the sails, without drifting too much because they have a current flowing this way. So they have, once they're in this river, they can pretty much govern where they're going, up or down the river. They can play the wind against the current. So Downey, the British commander, he stops. He can't quite see the hulls of the American vessels. Each fleet can see the other's mastheads over Cumberland Point. So they're somewhere in this area. Downey goes off by a boat to go around the point, has his gig crew roam around, wants to get a better look at the American dispositions. The American fleet are anchored in a line. So he makes up his mind how he's going to attack, comes back, he gives orders to his other commanders who are all gathered on board his flagship, and they proceed to sail into the action. By this time, it's somewhere around 8:15, somewhere between 8:15 in the morning. Now, we don't know exactly what time. Number one, there's no standardization of time zones back then. Number two, who's saying the watches agree? Number three, the American accounts differ a bit from the British accounts. So what really counts here is that it's a relative timing. It's maybe an hour and a half after daylight. They have come around the point, and what the British are endeavoring to do
is to try to hold as close up to the wind as they can get. In a naval battle in those days, what you wanted was the weather gauge, the upwind side. Think of it like the high ground, the uphill side in a land battle. It's just which way's uphill can shift every time the wind shifts. Trying to get to windward's the hard part. You have to sail along on one tack, and when you run out of room, you sail back on the other, and you're making very little ground on each tack. Think of going upwind as going uphill. Think of going up a mountain road full of switchbacks. As soon as you turn around and run, you can pick up speed and run, but if you've got to turn around and come back the other way, you'll be the rest of the day doing that. So if you have any choices about it, what do you try to do? You try to hold your ground to windward. So the British have come around, and a couple of their smaller ships are leading. The Confiance, the largest frigate, and the Finch is trailing behind. She's pretty slow. She's a captured merchant vessel. And they come around the point. They're out of gun range at this point. But these ships are moving along in this direction. And by about 8:30, and this wind is light, probably less than 10 knots. Ships like this are going to move at about half wind speed at the most. In 10 knots of wind, maybe it's only blowing 7 or 8. We don't know how hard it was blowing. We know it wasn't significant wind, or the galleys never would have been able to row in it. We know it's generally light air. It's enough breeze for them to maneuver and to cover these distances. So our estimate is they're covering 3 or 4 knots. 4 knots, it's going to be 15 minutes to the mile. So around 8:30, they've gotten themselves in range, but once they come around, they've got a problem now. Notice these tracks are not well above the American positions. The American squadron, Eagle, Saratoga, the Ticonderoga, the Preble, they're anchored in a line here, stationary position, and waiting for the British to come to them. And what the British would really like to do is be able to sail up here and be able to take a position across their bows where they could fire down the length of their decks. Certainly be able to stay upwind. But the problem they have is that even though the wind is out of the north or maybe even a little to the east, when they're coming down the river, once they come around the point, 2 things are happening. The wind is swung a bit to the northwest, and it's going light and getting shifty and getting to what they call baffling airs. So if you realize, as I said, that they can only do about 80 degrees off the wind, and the wind has come around to a bit west of north, they're going to be they can't even sail above a course of west. So they're trying to do the best they can to stay to windward, but they're not really making it. And they're just hoping to get in range to be able to engage the Americans before they get set down well to leeward. So the opening rounds are coming from the American vessels, who have plenty of time to aim and get lined up on them. The British are in a bad position because they have to endure end-on fire that they can't respond to very easily. And so they start taking some damage early into the action. And let's close the Confiance up to where they get to action positions. Yes?
Folks would like to move down here. You're welcome. You can see it a lot better here.
Yeah, because then we'll shift back the other way, but yes, wherever.
Mention those just before you go over there.
Mention.
Yeah. And while you go get set up.
Right.
We'll talk about that.
Right.
I'm going to ask folks if that fade out is affecting what they can hear. I want to ask them real quick.
Can everybody still hear me clearly? No? Is this better? Yeah. All right, sorry, I'm gonna have to hold this thing. It's not clipped on well enough. So the British are not quite able to follow their plan just as they'd like. They are coming in, doing the best they can. The Lynette gets up to a position that is pretty much where she's wanted, not ideal, but at least able to engage the foremost vessel in the American line, the Eagle. And all of these, if they don't make too much sense here, they're going to make a lot more sense when there's on a scale that's much bigger over on the other side. But this is the big picture that the British fleet came around Cumberland Head. American fleet is stationary defensive position. The British are trying to get to windward, but they really can't because the wind has shifted around a bit to the west. As they get in closer, they're starting to get hit, and the Confiance has an anchor shot away. She sails on a little further, has another anchor shot away, and this anchor, we believe, is her sheet anchor that was located recently in the lake, and that helps fix a lot of this positioning. And what we think is going on is that once Downey realizes he's losing his anchors, pretty soon he's not getting above the American squadron. If the wind shifts any more to the west, he's not even going to be able to engage at all. And he's supposed to engage today. This isn't maybe his choice or when he'd like to do it. He doesn't feel ready to do it. The ship was just built. He stops to put the carpenters ashore who are trying to finish her up. She's extremely crude. But he's got to do this because his orders are you have to support the Army commander who's making an attack this day. So he comes in, decides he's got to do the best he can. If he waits a whole lot longer, enduring fire coming across his bows, he might lose all his options. So once he's in range, he rounds up, anchors. The American ships are already anchored, and some of these other positions will make more sense if we look at them on the larger scale over there. Before we go over there, one last note to point out is these other arcs represent, and I'll turn it over to Jerry for a second to lay them out.
Colonel Fitzsimmons knows more about the local situation in the ports in Plattsburgh. The only thing I want to mention that played in on both the British court-martial testimony and the Americans is, as far as the gunnery is concerned, the ranges of the batteries on shore and the ranges on ship. Did one reach the other? Did that one reach this one? The arcs you see right here mark the extreme range of the guns that were on shore. This outer mark marks the range or the arc of fire of a 8-inch mortar. British had 2 batteries of 8-inch mortars on shore. If those mortars had been able to reach the American fleet would have had to move. And the British, of course, were hoping that that would be the case. The significance of a mortar is the arc of fire. A mortar has that huge arc of fire like this, and a huge 8-inch, 64-pound shell coming down out of the heavens, going right through your ship. One of those hitting any of those ships places them in very big trouble. Second arc marks the 24-pounder long guns, which were the biggest guns that were on shore. Guns have a flat trajectory. Mortars and howitzers have the higher trajectory. And 24-pounder long gun extreme range is about 22 to 2,500 yards. So this marks the range of the longest range of guns from shore. So if that marks the longest range of a 24-pounder from shore, it stands to reason that the 24-pounders, the biggest long guns on the ships, also couldn't reach shore. So to explain the significance of all that, I'll turn it over to Colonel Fitzsimmons.
Let me pull this out. I thought I could use this.
Thanks, Walter.
I think that one of the most important things that this great effort that Dean Mosier and the team has put together is the lines that were just explained to you briefly. That is, remember that the British Army is over there in red. Those are their batteries of guns. That the blue forts are the 3 American forts that you see closer to you. The significant thing about these gun ranges here in front of you is that in the British court-martial that occurred in 1815, almost a year later, the British naval officers that were participants in the battle and a British general officer who was on land stated, and the court-martial agreed and concluded that the reason the British lost the battle, the naval battle, was because when the British fleet engaged the Americans here in front of you, then,
This just went good.
yeah.
I think we lost the battery.
I got it.
Okay.
We won the battle. When the British fleet engaged the Americans, the British said in their court-martial that I'm out. Here I am. Why don't you hold that? There we go.
Right now.
Okay. They said that the reason that they lost was because the British fleet not only had to engage the American fleet, which was smaller, but it also had to be engaged by the American shore batteries, therefore increasing the strength of the American forces significantly. And that's why they lost, because they had to fight not only the Navy, American Navy, but they had to fight the American artillery on shore. We've shown here today, by plotting the distances that the largest American guns could fire, that indeed the American guns could not reach not only the American fleet, they couldn't reach the British fleet. The British, as an element of proof, said that the reason that Saratoga was set on fire by hot cannonballs was because the hot cannonballs were fired from their own batteries on the American shore Fort Scott. And that the British indeed did not have a shot furnace on board Confines, and you'll see this in the court-martial record. However, McDonough and his officers, after Confines were captured, went on board Confines and testified in their written record that they saw the shot furnace and they found still hot cannonballs on board Confines that had not been fired. Now, this has been a large point of contention with historians throughout the history of the study of this battle. And I think here today we've certainly proven that indeed the British were trying to come up with a reason why the Army caused the Royal Navy to lose instead of the Royal Navy losing on their own.
All right, now, the positions we chose to represent, are we still hearing me? Okay, the positions we chose to represent the American ships are based on diagrams, contemporary diagrams, but they're estimates. You know, the estimate is the American line was about a mile long. Well, that could be 3/4 of a mile, that could be a mile and a quarter, a mile and a half. But we figured, what would McDonough be thinking? He would want to place his vessels.
Walter, we're losing about every other word in there.
I'll just talk louder. Is that all right? Yeah. If McDonough had to fight from an anchored position, what's he going to do? He's going to anchor his ships where they're within range to support each other, so that if one is attacked, if gunboats gang up on one of them, he could swing the vessel, be able to drive them off. If one's captured, he can turn his guns against it. So we figured that the spacing of the American line would have to work out to far enough apart that if one of the ships started dragging its anchor and moving when it wasn't intended to, that they could get out of the way before they fouled the others. But not so far apart that they wouldn't be able to support each other, be in effective gun range. So that's how these positions were chosen. And then the east-west line was chosen based on where the confiance anchor was found. Some of the other considerations in terms of how far north-south this line was are based on, if the wind swings out of the south, McDonough has to worry if he starts dragging anchor, if the wind builds up to the extent that he can't hold an anchored position, has to sail out of there, he doesn't want to be trapped inside Cumberland Head. He has to choose an anchorage that's far enough south that he has an escape route should the weather turn. At the same time, he doesn't want to get driven onto the shoals by Crab Island or Valcour Island, so this is a compromised position. It's within the bay, it's in a relatively sheltered anchorage, it's outside of the range of the shore batteries, it's a position he can fight a defensive action from, it's a position he can escape from if he has to. Now, before we move the ships over to talk about the course of the fighting, now that we got this big picture, the English coming in and the principal vessels on both sides ending up anchored, so this becomes a stationary artillery duel for a fair part of the action, let's talk a little bit about anchoring. Because this figured very prominently. This is a very unusual battle in that so much of it was fought at anchor from both sides. So the handling of the anchors is an important part of the story. Now, one of the important things to know about anchoring with one of these anchors, and these are really too small for you to see, but the point about these old anchors is one fluke digs into the bottom when they get set, and anchoring with these, you have to do it properly or you can foul the anchor, you can wrap a cable around it, you can end up dragging it along the bottom and not holding the ship. Anchoring a ship is not just based on dropping an anchor. It's based on getting it in at the right angle. And you have to have several times the depth of water out so that the shank of the anchor, the long body of it, lies parallel to the bottom. One arm, one fluke stays dug in. So if you're right on top of it, it's going to be up and down. It's like holding a pick on the ground. You know, if it's not dug in, the handle's straight up and down. The arms of the pick aren't. But if you drive that pick into the ground and have a flat parallel pole with a handle, then you've got a set anchor. So you need a longer length of cable out. The absolute minimum that you could expect to hold in is about 3 times the depth of water out. Most of the time you're going to anchor with about 5 times the depth of water out. So if you're in 40 feet of water, you're going to initially drop an anchor, pay out about 200 feet of cable. So that's the standard method of anchoring. Now the confiance, when she came in, which is my confiance model, this one, okay. When the confiance is on the way in, one bower anchor gets shot away, it's lost. So that's gone. They lose their sheet anchor. Now the reason we think this is the sheet anchor, the anchor that was found, is that this type of anchor would normally be carried on the rail ready to drop as an emergency secondary anchor. The cannonball dent that's in that anchor is on the arm of the fluke. If it was hanging up and down ready to drop, the only way you'd get that kind of dent in it is if you dropped it out of the sky. So it was a horizontal shot, and it cost them that anchor. We think both of these anchors that were lost were on the port side, because as I explained over here, they're trying to hold up to the wind, which is coming northwest, to work their way to windward of the American vessels. So this vessel is crabbing along, doing the best she can to get up to windward, and her port side is more exposed to fire from the Saratoga, which is already anchored. So the confiance, Downey recognizes that he's got to anchor pretty soon while he still has the chance, so he rounds up to the wind. Probably she swings in an arc, comes up to the wind, drops that anchor, pays down on it, gets it well set with about this much cable out, and now he's fighting the Saratoga, broadside to broadside. Later in the battle, his port side guns, the larboard guns, the other word for port, are so badly damaged, a lot of guns knocked out of action, the ship's shot up, they decide that they have to turn around, and so they start to try to spring the ship around, and a spring on a cable is where you have 2 lines going to the one anchor. Now ideally you'd pre-position your anchors with your main heavy cable that might hold in storms and a lighter cable in a fair weather situation, and by if you had both out, you might have the heavy cable to one end, the spring cable to the other. You could position the ship, pulling one, slacking out the other. In this case, the spring on the confiance is shot away early in the action, so they've already got the anchor out and dropped. The best they can do is bend on another line on that starboard side. So when the time comes for them to have to spring around, what they have to do is slack out on the primary anchor cable, the bow cable, and the wind is going to take the ship around. But they will also have to have crew pulling on the stern to try to transfer the load to the stern so that she can get swung around. They don't quite make it. While they get partway around and are facing end on to the Americans, they have enough casualties, enough men are killed or wounded. This is all late in the battle. This is already where many men are hurt, that they end up having to give up on it and surrender. Now, the Saratoga had very similar problems. Before the action, McDonough positioned the ship not only with his bower anchor out ahead, but he had a stern anchor ready to go. He had lighter anchors called his kedge anchors, and these different types of anchor, bower, sheet, kedge, they're all the same kind of anchor. It's their relative functions. You know, the bower anchors are your main anchors you use all the time from the bow. Your sheet anchor is an emergency spare anchor, usually heavier than the bowers. Stream anchor, you usually hung astern to keep you parallel to a riverbank. Kedge anchors were usually carried out by a boat away from the ship and dropped so you could pull the ship towards them. So the Saratoga is set up with kedge anchors out to either side, the bower anchor out, the stern anchor ready to let go. Now at some point, I don't know in detail whether he had a spring on every single anchor cable. He probably did. But during the action, these are going to get damaged, going to get shot away. So at some point, the Saratoga comes to the same realization as the Confiance. They've got to turn around because they've got so many guns out of action on the starboard side. Their only hope of continuing is if they get the ship winded, as they used to say. Wind ship was to spin her around, present the other broadside. But McDonough has probably had enough springs shot away that he doesn't really have the capability of doing this by hauling another line up to the bower anchor as the Confiance is trying to do. So what he says in his after-action report is cut the bower, cut the bow cable, drop the stern anchor, and as soon as he cuts the bow cable, this wind out of the north is going to start carrying the ship down and away, and as she fetches on the stern anchor, once that's got enough out to bite, she'll spin around, now be hung by the stern. And that's how he succeeds in presenting his broadside, port broadside to the British. On the Confiance, they are trying the same maneuver and basically can't pull it off. The other instance of anchoring in the battle that's significant is the Eagle starts out ahead of the American squadron, and we'll talk about the damage she takes a little later on. But at some point, she has to let an anchor go, slip the cable or cut it, and sails downwind, ends up downstream of the Saratoga, and anchors again. And at this point, he doesn't state he has a stern anchor. It could have been another bower anchor. But if you dropped a bower anchor as you were sailing along, but had a spring already bent onto it, tied onto it, that you could tighten from a stern point, as that anchor went out, you could transfer the load and it becomes a stern anchor, and then you could have accomplished changing broadsides. So the anchoring is a very big part of this battle. It's standard seamanship of the age. There's nothing about this that is a brilliant innovation or a stroke of genius for anybody to plan this out. This is just part of the stock of professional knowledge of a naval officer of the time. How do you moor your ship? How do you anchor your ship in heavy weather? How do you get off your anchor? How do you handle your ship as the weather shifts? How do you plan to be able to rotate your ship around to always present your broadsides if you're in a stationary moored situation? So this is pretty standard seamanship, but it's skillful application of it. Now that's how you set it up, but what actually happens in the action, you get so shot up that you lose this, you lose that. What are your options 2 hours into this? How do you make do with what you've still got left? That's where it gets considerably harder. So to make the rest of this, to put it in sequence now, to go through the sequence of the battle, we're going to take a minute to move these models over, position them on the floor, and invite you all to join us, or at least move to that end, because you can see it on a much larger scale there where you get off of this chart. This is 3.5 times bigger over here.
American Navy. We had a gentleman here earlier from the Naval Academy class of 45. Who's he?
48.
48. Oh, excuse me. Class of 48. And you studied this, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that in the 1979, we were redoing the textbook at the Naval Academy. I was teaching there at that time, and one of the things that I found particularly interesting is I went back and reviewed a lot of the textbooks that had been used over the years. U.S. Navy and the Royal Navy study this battle for two different reasons. The Royal Navy puts this in a case study with the Battle of the Nile. And the lesson that they learned from it is the French at the Battle of the Nile, anchored off Aboukir Bay, did not choose their position well. Nelson was able to double them, come in between them and the shore with half of his fleet, and be on the other side with the other half of the fleet, and force them to surrender. Now the U.S. Navy, and then they study this as this is a case where the Navy, the American Navy, placed its ships correctly. That while they're quite a ways offshore and to the naked eye would appear too far, that this is a case where McDonough knew the sailing conditions, knew the wind conditions, and remember there had been quite a change from the night before when you had a south wind, and he did it so that you couldn't get in there. You just could not get around his end. Now, when you pick up the textbook, were you using the United States and World Sea Power? I think came out in 45, and Westcott.
That was 50 years ago.
Well, there's going to be an exam. We're going to man the boards. We'll.
The thing, though, that I think is crucial in this battle and the Battle of Valcourt is the major tenet of the Royal Navy, and that's engage. The hell with anything else. If there's an enemy there, you engage. And that got them in trouble here, and it got them in trouble in Valcourt.
Well, that's definitely true. But the reason, come back to that in a second, the reason the Americans studied this was thorough preparation. Not only thorough preparation for McDonough in placing his fleet, but also in setting out the spring lines that were able to turn the ship. And of course, the climactic point of the battle, many will argue, is after the United States and McDonough have swung his flagship, the British try the same thing, and as Walter was saying, they get caught, so that then the Americans can rake them. But for at the Naval Academy, this is a lesson in preparation. Your comment I find interesting on the British and engage. One of the things that I talk about with students is that by the time, excuse me, at the time of the War of 1812, the British had a pattern. If you read a pretty interesting book on the War of 1812 called The Age of Fighting Sail by C.S. Forrester, who's probably better known for his Hornblower novels. But in this book, published in about 1958-59, he says that the British lost the War of 1812. Remember, he's an Englishman writing this because of a level of arrogance, he says, and that they were rusty because they hadn't had any real engagements since Trafalgar in 1805. I argue it's a little bit different than that, but sort of the same theme. My theme is that the British were used to fighting the French, and now they're fighting the Americans. When the French would engage the British, the French commanders thought they'd had a victory if they brought most of their ships home. So the French would basically fire high at the sails and the rigging of the British in an effort to disable their ships, which would then allow them, at least in theory, to get into position to hammer the British into submission. Well, the British moved right in and started firing into the hulls, fired on the downward roll as the ship began to roll in a battle. Well, the British then were not used to an enemy that continued the battle, one that did not engage, and 3 times they met Americans who fought a little different than the French. One of these is in the painting which Dean has done, and you can see over here, and that's John Paul Jones, the Bonhomme Richard versus the Serapis. Yeah, this is it. Now look at the damage that's taken by that ship. Jones does not surrender. Jones does not haul off. Jones locks him in a deadly embrace, and Jones' ship will sink the next day. They're not used to fighting this, and you've got the same situation up at Lake Erie, where essentially Perry has to abandon his flagship, move to a different ship to finish the battle, and now you've got this battle where McDonough, most will argue, had taken much more punishment in the early part of the battle, but rather than surrender or attempt to withdraw or anything, in fact, obviously he's picked a position where he can't withdraw, where he knows this is going to be a fight to a clear victory, and his ship is just ruined and is terribly damaged, but he continues the fight. So I agree with you totally that the British have this attitude to just go right at them and slug it out, but they're slugging it out with Americans in these cases rather than with the French, whose hope it is to maintain their ships and escape back to port. I just thought I'd interrupt here a minute while they were replacing the ships, and I'll turn it back to them.
The other thing you can say about Perry, I have not yet begun to find. Well, that was Jones.
Well, that was Jones, yeah.
But
Perry
was don't give up the ship.
Well, that was Perry's. He had a pennant, "Don't give up the ship." That was actually from James Lawrence, his good friend, who had commanded against the Shannon, and had those were his final words as he was carried below. He's buried up in Halifax, and Perry took the "Don't Give Up the Ship" and made a pennant for it. And indeed, one of the things that Dean does, these are companion pieces. One of them is the naval officer at the crucial point. Dean identifies the crucial point, or the critical point in that battle, as the time in which Perry decided to transfer from one ship to the other. And in that portrait, Chris, if you'd hold up this is a photograph of that portrait, which you might hand around if you want to. You notice, I think he's being handed the "Don't Give Up the Ship" pennant in that at that moment. Are you guys ready to take back over?
This is in fairly good sized detail, but most of it occurs up in this end, so we welcome you to walk up so you can get a much better view up here. Ably described the approach of the British fleet, and this is the point where both fleets pretty much opened fire, at least as far as the British formed into line of battle and opened. The leading British ship coming in line would have been the Chubb, all the way up at the far end. Now the Chubb carried only 11 guns. It sounds like a lot, but there was one 6-pounder long gun, which was basically a pop gun, and she had 10 18-pounder carronades. Now a carronade is a short-barreled cannon that has less than half the range of a long gun. And it has a lot of advantages. It's much shorter, it's much lighter, takes fewer men to operate, you can load it and fire it twice as fast. So a lot of good advantages. The major disadvantage, it has less than half the range. So if your ship is armed mostly with carronades, you have to fight at extremely close range. And an 18-pounder carronade has a point-blank range of only 260 yards. So the Chubb was going to have to get into extremely close range to be able to open fire. Now the problem was she was coming up on the starboard bow of the Eagle, and the Eagle is carrying 20 guns, 10 guns to a side, and she's got long 12-pounders and 32-pounder carronades. So the Chubb, as she's moving in, is suffering from the fire of the Eagle's long guns, trying to get within range. Now, both the Chubb and the Finch were American gunboats. They were the Eagle and the Growler that were captured further up on the lake, or down the lake, in 1813 and converted to use by the British. So these were originally American gunboats, but now they were used by the British. So the Chubb, as she's coming in, is suffering punishment until she reaches a point approximately 250 to 300 yards from the Eagle. Then the Eagle loses a broadside, absolutely devastating broadside on the Chubb with 32-pounder carronade. A 32-pounder carronade has a range about 330 yards, but you're talking 6¼ inch diameter ball, a solid iron ball weighing 32 pounds. So the effect of a broadside of 10 guns hitting on that little cutter-rig ship, as I say, absolutely devastating. Now the Chubb did get a few rounds, or a few broadsides off, but not too many. In a matter of only minutes, that ship suffered, a crew of 32 suffered 6 men killed and 16 wounded. So it did not take long before the Chubb is completely blasted out of the action. She starts to drift downrange. Now her captain, who was Lieutenant McGee, went below deck about this time. He gave up command of the ship. He was wounded twice. He lost the tip of 2 fingers and he received a leg wound. How severe the leg wound is open to debate. Before the British court-martial occurred, he decided that he wanted to become an American citizen. So he did not show up for the court-martial and never testified. He took off. He deserted. So the Chubb starts to drift downrange. Now the problem with this is, as she's drifting downrange, she's going right in front of the Lynette and right in front of the Confiance, masking her guns. So, for a point in time at least, neither of these British ships are able to fire as the Chubb is slowly drifting downrange. Now, her mainsail had been knocked over the starboard side, so with the wind direction and that sail acting as a rudder, more or less, she starts drifting into the American position, until eventually she reached a point between the Saratoga and the Ticonderoga. Now, one thing that McDonough did before the battle was lower his small boats on the disengaged side. So they were sitting there waiting. A midshipman and a number of men were sent in one of those small boats out to the Chub, where they took possession of her. Actually, you can see where the orange marker is where the Chub actually struck her flag and surrendered. But she did continue to drift downrange until one of the Saratoga's small boats came out, took possession of her, and towed her out of the action. So the Chub is gone out of the action very early. The Lynette also moves in, and she is armed with 16 guns, all long 12-pounders. So she moves into position, anchors, and opens fire, primarily on the Eagle. The Confiance also moves in, and very, very deliberately, everything to a T, because Downey wanted to make sure that the first broadside of the Confiance was well aimed. Made sure that the courses, the mainsails were secured, the anchor was set, because that first broadside, she had 14 24-pounder carronades on one side that were able to bear. Now, 24-pounder fires a cannonball about 4.5 inches of diameter, weighing 24 pounds. But that first broadside, each of those guns was double shotted. So there's two 24-pounder balls, and on top of that, there's a round canister. A canister is nothing but a tin can filled with smaller iron balls. In this case, a 24-pounder, the balls would be about the size of a ping pong ball, about 36 of them. What canister does is turns one of these cannons into a giant shotgun. Absolutely devastating personnel. So those guns are triple charged. 2 rounds of solid shot and a round of canister shot. So you don't want to waste that round. So Downey made sure all of his cannons were lined up, or all his ducks were in a row. He anchored, very deliberately let loose that first broadside. And that's one of the things that everybody who describes this battle talks about, is the effect of that first broadside on the Saratoga. 50 men were knocked down on board the Saratoga by that first broadside. That also was damaging to the British, because these guns are elevated by coins, basically triangular wood blocks that you move in and out to elevate or lower the barrel. Now, those first broadsides, the coins slipped out a little bit, the guns elevated. Most of these crewmen were inexperienced. They were either soldiers or some Canadians or British seamen, merchantmen. They had not had time to train on these guns. They didn't really know what they were doing that well. So most of the guns were not reset. So thereafter, although guns did continue to hit the Saratoga, many of their shells were now going over the bulwarks through the rigging. They just didn't reset the guns. So that first broadside, although it was absolutely devastating, was also to a small degree beneficial to the Americans. So the Confiance now is also opening fire. Part of the Saratoga's broadside, her forward division of guns are aimed at the Lynette, and her aft division of guns are aimed at the Confiance. They're working back and forth, but these two ships are basically firing at each other. Coming in, the last ship coming in on the British line is the Finch, probably the most controversial of all the British ships and her actions. Now, the Finch was supposed to come down and take on the Ticonderoga and also the Preble, and the gunboats were supposed to come back down and support her. Now, Lieutenant Hicks also only had 11 guns, several 6-pounders and also 18-pounder carronades, meaning that he would also have to get within very close range to use those carronades. And Hicks, to the best of our knowledge, never came really closer than about 500 yards. At the court-martial testimony, even his own midshipman, his second in command, said that the one mistake that Hicks made was not anchoring. And one of the commanders of the gunboats also criticized Hicks for not anchoring. But it seems like his track all along, as he was coming in, went much further south than what Downey or anybody expected him to do. But he came down to a point about halfway between the Ticonderoga and the Preble, and he opens fire. Of course, the Ticonderoga was 17 guns, and the Preble, which has 7 9-pounders, is firing on the Finch. Now, the Finch, there's apparently an arc of cannonballs that were found out in this area, which marks the spot where we feel that the Finch sat there for a very brief time and suffered some heavy damage. She never anchored. She continues to drift down range, down towards the Crab Island. As she is drifting down range, 4 of the gunboats start moving in. Another one of the controversial areas for the British was the commander, the commodore of the gunboats. He came in with the gunboats, came within 600 yards of the American line, raised the signal to engage closely, to move in. Then he turned his boat around and left the bay. He also never showed up for the court-martial. So it appears that only 4 of the British gunboats moved in to the position you see at the end of the arrows here. They were firing on both the Preble and the Ticonderoga. The Preble, the Finch continues to drift out of range, but she's firing on the Preble. The commander of the Preble sees these gunboats coming in, firing on her, feels that she is going to be boarded by these gunboats, and she cuts her anchor, slips her cable, cuts and runs, starts to drift, gets under control, and then sets sail and sails over under the protection of the batteries on shore. That puts the Preble out of action. The Finch is continuing to drift down range, and she is still firing on the Ticonderoga. Eventually the Finch is damaged enough she wants to leave the battle. She twice tries to tack, but she's damaged, she misses stays. Then her pilot tells her she has enough room to wear ship, in other words, to turn with the wind as opposed to against the wind. But when you turn with the wind, you lose windage. Walter, my terminology here.
You just increase the distance down. So you try and tack up into the wind. You have to cross the wind, the sails are luffing. She couldn't make it. The rigging was so damaged, she didn't have enough way on to make it across the wind. Fell off, tried again, failed to tack, and then decided, well, her only opportunity is to wear ship, go before the wind. On a modern sailboat, they refer to this as jiving, where you swing your main slow to the other side of the wind behind you. On a square rig vessel where you turn yards around, it's called wearing. But once you turn away from the wind, you're almost sure to make the maneuver, but you're going to pick up speed. You're going to pick up distance in a hurry, and you have to turn a wider circle. So the estimate is that he's got enough room to do this. But probably with this damaged rig, the ship's moving more slowly than they realize in terms of the rate of turn versus the rate she's going downwind, or they're closer to the shoal on Crab Island than they realize. And in point of fact, they're almost around the turn, they almost make it, and they run aground on Crab Island.
Right over here. Continue the arc, and Finch goes on ground on the shoal to the northwest side of Crab Island.
So she strikes on her starboard quarter, which actually brings her starboard guns to bear on Crab Island, where there's an American battery of guns, manned by militiamen, I believe. They have a very short duel where the Finch's guns drive off the gunners, the American gunners. They abandon their guns, but the Finch, for all intents and purposes, is out of the battle. She is stuck fast. She tries to kedge off. Walter explained the kedge anchor. She tried to kedge off, but was unsuccessful. So the Finch is now out of the battle. The gunboats do move in. Distances, we're not really sure how close they came, but they did engage the starboard quarter of the Ticonderoga, but they were attempting to board and carry the Ticonderoga, but were unsuccessful. The fire of the Ticonderoga's guns were just too strong. The gunboats, these were about the only gunboats that played any major role in the battle at all. You're talking these rowboats, they're row galleys. They have a sail on them, but at this point in time they're using their oars. And you have a lot of men on them and only one gun that will bear. And you're moving into a ship that has 17 guns. One heavy ball or two heavy balls into one of those ships is going to sink them. So these are very fragile boats, and the men in them are not experienced. A lot of them are Canadian militiamen or soldiers, and they're not real happy about being where they are doing what they're doing. So they didn't really dare close in to engage. Now that same goes with the American gunboats. There were a number of American gunboats starting out in two divisions. They were between the American ships about 40 yards back supporting. If the British did attempt to come in and rake them, the gunboats were supposed to protect them and also support them. Only one American gunboat under a midshipman who had some nerve came around the bow of the Ticonderoga to engage the British gunboats. Was struck a couple times, suffered some casualties, several casualties, and that gunboat was placed out of the action. The rest of the American gunboats pretty much hovered in the rear waiting for their opportunity. And apparently their opportunity never came because they didn't do anything. So that leaves us now with nothing but the Eagle, Saratoga, the Lynette, and the Confiance. And they are blasting away at each other for hours. for about 2 hours, I guess, whatever the time frame may be. So finally, the Saratoga, with most of her starboard battery, blasted out. I mean, her guns, all of her starboard guns were completely out of action, and also the Eagle up here had been hit hard. Now, as Walter explained, with the springs, they could turn these ships any which direction they want, pretty much any direction, a little bit to bring their guns to bear. The Eagle's spring line had been shot away. So at this point, she would have to swing with the wind, and in that case, her guns probably wouldn't bear. So at this point, either her anchor cable was shot away or she slipped her cable.
The Eagle moves before the Saratoga winds ship.
Right. So now, as Walter explained earlier, if you would like to again, the movements of the Eagle.
Well, at this point, he's got to get the ship underway. He makes that determination. I'll just put the anchor on deck. They didn't have time to retrieve it. They just cut the cable. They probably would have braced their yards, and they might have even been set up this way before the battle started to push her head around. You see, and the topsails were ready to set. Probably the yards were hoisted, the sails loosely furled in lines that could be broken, rotten stops they're called. So as soon as you pull on the sheets, you break them out, you set a sail. And so with this pushing her head off, she would start backing down, going astern, and it would take a little bit to build up some momentum, so when you shifted the rudder, her stern comes around, takes a minute to get the sails set, but once these topsails are set, pushing her head around, she's going to back up pretty quickly. And as she backs up, the wind's going to come around far enough out of this northwest quadrant that it'll just start to fill the main. And when the sails on the mainmast fill, that's time to haul the braces around. She also set a jib, triangular sail forward. So once these sails are filled, she's got to reverse her direction, start going ahead. She'll pick up leeway. She'll just drift sideways a little bit before that kicks in. But once she's gained way, she's under fire from the Lynette. But now this is a question that Henley, we don't know exactly why he did this. McDonough was very critical of him afterwards, because once he shifted position down here, the Saratoga is exposed to the full fire of the Lynette as well as the Confiance. The Eagle was supposed to stay engaged to the Lynette. Now, the Eagle has a very inexperienced crew. A lot of her crew are the convicts of the Army, the petty thieves, people who've gotten in disciplinary problems for one reason or another, and they get out of jail if they're willing to serve on this crew.
Plus the Army band was on board the Eagle.
Yeah, so this is not a crack naval crew. They haven't had a long time to work together and sort this out. We don't know how many of his lines or springs were shot away. Remember, all these people are rigging springs so that they can swing the ship a bit this way, a bit this way. During this time, the wind isn't absolutely constant. So to a single anchor, the vessel will pivot like a weather vane. If they still need to engage, they need to haul in on a spring line on the anchor cable to twist the ship. But at this point, he's got enough damage on his starboard side. He feels that in order to stay in the fight, he's got to swing the ship around. Maybe they were intending to wind ship in station, and somebody screwed up and let the cable go. Maybe they let the cable go and the other crew wasn't ready to let the stern anchor go. And all of a sudden he realizes he's drifting back. And this is speculation on our part. His after-action report doesn't record having these difficulties on board, but Henley is an officer who, a lot of pride involved. Maybe he'd rather say he thought it was better to take a different position than to say that, the crew weren't able to do this. But this is contrary to his orders to stay in one place. But he's not taking the ship out of the fight. He's just trying to get into a position where he can fight more effectively. Once he's lost that anchor, though, he's got to do something, because he's drifting down and he might foul Saratoga. So he has to get her underway. He has to get the ship back under control, and he has to get this crew reorganized, and he has to get organized to anchor again. So in that time, he's picked up speed. He's sailing down, because now he's got the wind right behind him. This whole sequence is not necessarily taking from losing an anchor or deliberately cutting the anchor if the topsails are already ready to set. It's maybe a minute, minute and a half to get them set. It's maybe another minute to drop a couple of ship lengths, brace the yards around, get underway. This is 3-4 minutes into it. This whole thing's taking maybe 5 minutes. They sail past Saratoga, and at this point, they get to a position downwind of Saratoga, drop a stern anchor, or drop the other bower anchor perhaps, and have a spring on it from the stern. But however they manage to accomplish it, they get her anchored by the stern so that she's got her port side bearing again, or broadside bearing, and they're ready to re-engage. And at this point, the Eagle's back in the battle, firing at Confiance, but she's not firing at Lynette anymore, and the Saratoga is unsupported against the fire of both vessels.
As soon as the battle with her larboard broadside, which had not been used, although some of the guns were probably knocked out because these guns, these heavy balls are going straight through the side of the ship, so it's not just one side of the ship that's being damaged. There is a lot of damage, some damage also, who knows how much, on the larboard side, but there are certainly more guns able to be operated on the larboard side than on the starboard side. So the Eagle is now firing at the Confiance. The Saratoga at this point in time has suffered an incredible amount of damage. You have to think about what was going on the decks of these ships at this point in time. These decks with yards and rigging coming down, men being crushed, men literally being cut in half. These decks of these ships were one scene of absolutely incredible horror. So all the confusion, the carnage, and the men still trying to keep a sound mind and fight while all this, and this all was going on for a period of about 2 hours. This had to be just an absolutely incredible scene on the decks of all of these ships, and it's something that we just need to remember about the men who fought this battle. So the Saratoga, after a period of about 2 hours, the guns on her starboard side, she suffered a considerable amount of casualties, but every gun on her starboard side had been knocked out of action. So at this point in time, she had an option. I mean, she had a choice. I mean, McDonough could either surrender or he could complete the maneuver, which he had prepared for very wisely and intelligently prepared for before the battle began. Walter?
In this case, he slipped his bow cable, cut the cable, let the ship spin around, got her to a hanging on a stern anchor, which after he paid out a little scope would fetch up, and he now had his broadside bearing again. There was also use of a spring line involved here. Probably the way this would have worked was he'd cut the bower cable, had a spring to fetch on that same anchor just from the other end of the ship. And if that spring was shot away, he'd have to rig the next one because his stern anchor, we know he was using a spring to get around on. Probably just as the Eagle, it was another bower anchor that he got another cable on, bent on in a hurry, so it would fetch up to hold her from the stern. Otherwise, when he put the next anchor down, she'd just spin around yet again and hang from the bow. So a lot of frantic action to make this happen because some of his lines are being shot away as they're being used. But they are successful. They do get the ship hanging on an anchor that's primarily astern of them, just as the Eagle is. And so their less damaged port broadside can now engage.
So the Eagle, the Saratoga, just like the Eagle, several of her larboard guns probably out of action. But for all intents and purposes, the two largest American ships have just brought 2 fresh broadsides to bear against the British. The Lynette apparently still has several of her guns in action, has made no effort to maneuver, but the Confiance at this point in time has suffered again an incredible amount of damage, and like the Saratoga, almost every gun on her larboard side has been knocked out of action. So it's time now for the Confiance to attempt the same maneuver that the Saratoga did.
And at this point, as I mentioned over there, they're paying out on the bower cable, they're heaving in on the spring, and at some point as you do this, you swing end on to your opponent, you're exposed to raking fire. The Saratoga was and the Eagle were as they did the maneuver. Now it's the Confiance's turn. She gets partway through the maneuver, None of her guns can respond. The Saratoga has gotten into her new position first, can launch a full or a much heavier broadside. It comes sweeping down the deck, raking fire, which can just travel the length of the deck, taking out many people. And they have several men killed and wounded who are hauling on the spring line. So,
situation, really, if you remember, we talked about on the Eagle, the crew on there. This is the same with the Confiance. The crew was brand new. I mean, the night before the battle, they were still working to complete this ship. It had just been launched a few days before, actually about 10 days before. The crew, many of them had just joined the ship, so they were not an experienced, trained crew. They didn't, they were not really, they just were not working well together. After 2 hours of suffering heavy casualties, probably in one way or another, every man on board that British ship had been wounded. I mean, whether it's a slight wound or what, but her casualties were extremely heavy. And when she was trying to wind around, and she's suffering raking fire from the Saratoga, and as those men are working on those lines, and a cannonball plows through the middle of them, and several of them were killed or wounded, that was it. They knew they were in deep, deep trouble. Their morale was gone. And the will to fight was gone. So at that point in time...
When was Downey killed?
Downey was killed only about 15 minutes into the battle. Probably shortly after the Chubb drifted downrange, Downey was standing directly behind a 24-pounder cannon when it was hit. The muzzle was hit dead on. He was standing directly behind it. The gun was dismounted. It slammed right into his midsection. They say it did not even break the skin, but the blunt trauma killed him. So Downey was killed early on in the battle, and the first lieutenant took command of the British ship, of the Confiance. So with many of their officers, the inexperienced crewmen, many of them probably ran below, unwilling to continue the battle, and it was at that point that the battle, for all intents and purposes, was over, because the Confiance, the largest British ship, was hung up. Her crew gave up. And a few minutes after that, she lowered her flag in surrender. Captain Pring on the Lynette kept firing for about 15 more minutes, but he knew also he was not going anywhere. His yards and rigging were heavily damaged. He was not able to sail out of the harbor. He was hoping that the gunboats would come in and either evacuate his crew or help him tow him out of the harbor, but the gunboats abandoned him. So 15 minutes after the Confiance capitulated, the Lynette also lowered her flag. The Finch still hung up, still had her flag up. As with the Lynette, he was hoping that the gunboats would either evacuate his crew or help tow him off the reef of Crab Island, but the gunboats abandoned him and sailed off, and then the Finch also lowered her flag. And once the Finch's flag came down, the battle was over. All four of the large British ships had been captured.
We don't know exactly how the Confiance ended up, but in all likelihood, once the men working the spring were killed or injured, if they stopped hauling in the spring, she'd start swinging head to wind again on the bower that was left. And if she started doing that, she'd start presenting her already damaged out of action side again. So without getting that spring around, whether it hung up and she stopped halfway through the maneuver, or whether they failed the maneuver and swung back the same way, either way they decided their position was hopeless. One note on the Finch, she had several holes below waterline that were from the size shot of the Preble. And she had several feet of water in her hold, and if they had managed to pull her off, she probably would have sunk. At this point, the Confiance has very severe damage. They're having to move the wounded up from the hold where they've taken them down so that they don't drown, because this ship is sinking. So they now have to bend all their efforts on damage control to try to get pumps, bailing, get material stuffed into the holes so that they can keep her afloat. So a couple of these vessels are very severely damaged.
And the point of controversy with the Eagle moving down below the Saratoga, as Walter explained, it left him exposed, the Saratoga exposed to the fire of the Lynette, but that was raking fire. Again, either enfilade or raking fire. Instead of having a cannonball hit your side and go down across the side of the ship, it's hitting near the end, where a single cannonball goes down the entire length or most of the length of the deck of the ship, causing more casualties and damage, because raking fire is the worst you can suffer. So by cutting or moving his position from from in front of the Saratoga and taking the fire of the Lynette away, he exposed the Saratoga to raking fire. And that's, McDonough was not very pleased with that situation.
All right, here we have what's going on at the end of the battle. The reason that I think McDonough is such a great man and needs to be remembered is he's on board Saratoga. Confiance is the largest thing that's ever been, largest warship ever built on the lakes. He's amazed at the size of her when she comes around Cumberland Head. He's been battling her for 2 hours plus. During that time period, he's seen friends die, he's seen crewmen slaughtered, he's watched his guns get knocked out of action. At one point, a shot has come in and splintered off a large piece from the boom and knocked him cold for several minutes. He gets up, shakes himself off, and within a few minutes is again directing the fire at Saratoga, at the Confiance. As he's starting, as he needs to turn, as all the guns are on his engaged side are knocked out, and he has to wind ship, and he's coming around, many reports say that he hung up, and he was having trouble doing so. Now remember, when the Confiance hung up, her crew at that point had had enough. They were under fire by the Eagle. The Saratoga was trying to come around, and they gave up. They surrendered. Well, in essence, if you transpose that, McDonough was in the same position. He was coming around, he was having difficulty, he had the same number, if not greater, casualty percentages that Confiance had, but he wouldn't give up. And the differential is he was able to come about. Now, during this time, he was thrown across the deck again when someone else he was standing to was hit by a ball, and part of that person came into him and threw him across the deck 20 feet, and again knocked him out. And he was able to get up again, direct so that he could re-anchor, reset so he could bring his unengaged guns to bear, because he didn't know that Confiance was going to give up or that they were having difficulty. He just knew he had to do what he had to do and continue to slug it out if it was necessary. He is also under fire, raking fire at this point from Lynette. So he's got his hands full. But the differential between these two is McDonough wouldn't give up. And because he wouldn't give up, he changed history. And that's what we need to remember, and that's what this whole exercise was to do, was to show what he went through to get to that point. And Chris, if you'd like to close. We're open to questions.
Dean, magnificent job. We're going to open the floor for questions. Jim, I know you're available, and Jerry. If any of you have questions, please feel free to offer them. But before we do that, let me thank Dean, Jerry, Jim, Walter, David Fitzens, all the members of the Battle of Plattsburgh Association, Park, and so forth. And I want to, actually I'm under orders to do this. The treasurer, Bill Rowe, who most of you know in the blue shirt, wants me to let you know that if you're not a member of the Battle of Plattsburgh Association, we're here, he's here to sign you up. We have membership forms, and I might add they make a great Christmas gift for another member of your family. So Bill, having said that, perhaps you want to go over to the membership desk while we turn the floor over to questions. Anybody?
I have one question while I'm on my way over. I was down at the Naval Academy a couple of weeks ago and saw the actual cannon that was on the Confiance that killed Downey.
Right.
How did that cannon get from the Confiance down to the Naval Academy?
Who wants to answer that one?
Jim.
Jim?
Probably no, don't you?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go right there.
Mention the flags, too.
When the battle was over, all these vessels were pulled together, and the crews from both navies and people from the shore came out, evacuated the wounded, most of the Crab Island, and pulled the ships together and tried to get them to stay above the water, pumping them out and so forth. Then the ships, the flags were presented to McDonough by the British as well as the swords of the officers that were in command. He returned the swords, saying that they'd fought so bravely that they deserved to keep their swords. And the flags from the British vessels were given to Lieutenant Casey, who was the commanding officer of the Ticonderoga, and he was dispatched immediately by cutter south down to New York City, to Philadelphia, to Baltimore, and to Washington, D.C. to present the flags to the United States federal government and to the Secretary of the Navy, Jones. The vessels then were salvaged, all of them eventually ending up at Whitehall together, and the trophy of the cannon was taken off and carried by ship down to Annapolis in Baltimore, Maryland, where other artifacts of the War of 1812 were pulled together, and eventually that cannon ends up in front of McDonough Hall, which is the gymnasium at the Naval Academy, and is there mounted today for all of you to see. And if you'd like to see without having to go all the way down there, take a look at our film, because we feature the muzzle blast against the front of that cannon. You can see graphically what a tremendous hit it was to drive a 2,500-pound cannon out of its slide, breaking the straps on the sides, and Downey catching it in his arms and crushing it.
Anyone else with a question? Yes, sir.
Although there was no ship-to-ship action, were there any U.S. Marines on the Eagle, the Saratoga, and Ticonderoga?
The question is, were there any U.S. Marines on the decks of either ship? David?
No, there were no U.S. Marines. All of the people, all of the soldiers that served on board the U.S. vessels were called provisional Marines, and that's where you'll see sometimes in writings they'll be referred to as Marines, but they were not members of the U.S. Marine Corps of the day.
Marines of course, Marines are sharpshooters, but they carried muskets, not rifles. Musket has an accurate range of only about 100 yards, max effective range, so the ships never really got close enough for a musket fire, and so the soldiers who were on board were acting as gun crewmen for the most part.
Question? Roger. Roger Forrest wants a reading list.
Well, it always depends on how much you want to read. There is a book called Great American Naval Battles, which was published 98, I believe, by the Naval Institute Press. And there is an article on this battle by William Dunn. And there's also an article, if you're interested, on the Battle of Elkhor Island, since that's also local. These are about 35-page articles. I think they print it out too, and have excellent analysis and have good footnotes and so forth that you can follow them up. Do you want to mention any book that might be coming out soon?
Well, yes, of course.
Amateur to Arms by Colonel John Elting has a good account of the naval battle as well as the land battle. Amateur to Arms. It's still for sale, DeCapo Press. And you can find it on Amazon.com has it.
What about your book?
Yeah, Roosevelt.
What about your book?
Well, in my book too, which will be out shortly. Just called The Decisive Battle of 1812.
Did you mention Roosevelt?
No.
No.
There's also one of the earliest books is the Naval War of 1812 by Theodore Roosevelt, which was just recently reissued by
Naval Institute Press. It's in the Classics of Naval Literature series.
Right, and that's available in paperback in most bookstores today. If they don't have it, they'll order it for you. It's currently available, published this year.
There's also a description in Alfred Thayer Mann's Sea Power and its relation to the War of 1812.
And Sea Power and its relation to the War of 1812 by Alfred Thayer Mann, who was the greatest, I guess the greatest naval scholar of the 19th century. Bill Rowe would also like to recommend, especially for younger readers, Murray's novel, 1960, called The Proudest Day. And it's available in the library. It's out of print, but your local library can get it. The Proudest Day. Good fiction. Any other questions? If not,
Let's have a round of applause for all these people and all the hard work they've done. I'm compelled to say one more thing, because sometimes we don't really appreciate the importance of saving things. And it may seem like a small detail, but if you look at the flags on the models of the British ships, one of them's a white ensign, one of them's a red one, and one of them's a blue one. Those are accurate. And the reason we know they're accurate is that McDonough, along with the cannon, transmitted those flags, as was a standing order at the time, and those flags still exist in the United States Naval Academy. And earlier this month, the archivist at the Naval Academy, at Dean Mosher's request, went, looked through the archives, and found the very flags that flew on those ships, laid them out, measured them to the inch, and sent a description and a measurement to the artist. So he's able now to say, and he's painting them exactly as they are, because someone 185 years ago followed orders which were to keep things like that. So if you've got stuff, don't throw it out. Thank you.
Could I say one other?
Yeah.
I want to just say one other thing. You wonder why this is done in addition to the search for knowledge. But if you take a look at a couple of the prints there, the work that Dean Mosher does, the key point I would make is that his paintings are absolutely accurate. So one of the things that he does is to use these models to get the exact placement. This allows him to walk around in 3D and pick what is the best perspective from which to show the key moment in the battle. I mean, you've seen dozens of paintings of the battle, but you'll see two things about those paintings usually. One of them is they want to get all the ships in. So to get all the ships into the battle, to show a lot of action, they get them in, but it has nothing to do with where they were. And for that reason, most of these visual representations are really not very useful as I would almost say, a learning or teaching tool. Excuse me. So that's one of the reasons that Dean does this, is to get the correct perspective. But it does allow him to move around then and say, well, if I looked from here, I would be able to see these ships. If I looked from here, I would see these others. And another point to be made is that his paintings, he could tell you how big they are. I think the one of the Bonhomme Richard is about 8 feet by what?
10 and a half.
8 by 10.5 feet. And they're all different sized. You'll notice the prints reflect the size, that he chooses that to get the right perspective. And that's the other thing that we're really about here. You know, he doesn't just say, well, you know, it's probably about there. He wants to know where it is. Thank you.
The next step after doing this, after y'all leave this afternoon, we're going to position the ships at various points, run a spotlight on them to have, we know the sun was about due east and about 30 degrees elevation off the horizon. We're going to get the shadow patterns and positions so that when those photographs are done and the position is picked, we can then come in and reconstruct the bulwarks, hopefully in this room, for the reenactors. And we're going to have the light, we're going to have the positions, we're going to have all the orientations correct to be able to then pose about the 250 figures that are going to be depicted in the paintings. So we're going to need reenactors. Hopefully we're going to need folks to help build the bulwarks. Hopefully we're going to be able to take those bulwarks out into the lake and blow holes in it to show people what the cannon demonstration damage looks like. And then maybe that will end up in the interpretive center to show what a combat section of a ship looks like. So there's a lot of work to do, and there's a lot more coming, but I hope you all have liked the initial steps to show where everything was on that day. So thank you very much.
Dean Mosher, this has been a tremendous weekend for me. I know it had to be satisfying for you.
Yeah, extremely. Extremely. I'm delighted.
What happens next?
Go home and get some sleep. That's the next thing that happens. We're going to take, as of this afternoon, we're going to take all these positions now, get them into the battle sequence, set up the lights, shoot the right shadows, grid all of this out on the maps so that we have it all with a time motion sequence, I have to go back, contact all the nice people who have been here, get all that taken care of, start getting the orientation so I can figure out where I want to do my painting, go into a photographic studio, and get the ships oriented the way I want them with all the right lenses that you need to really start seeing how you can do wide-angle drawings. You don't just use a straight camera for things like that. Then, after I pick the angle, I start doing my preliminaries of what the physical area was in the drawing, where the cannon stations, what's visible, what I'm going to need in relation to Americans, what I'm going to need in relation to that. I get with Jerry, we start talking about the uniforms, we start talking about gathering the reenactors, we start getting the bulwarks, the inside set made for all that, posing the reenactors. That's the next step, would be January. Other than that, I haven't got a thing to do.
Nothing else to do, and then by September, the finished product.
Right.
Will this be as large as the Lake Erie painting?
At least.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a plan?
Oh, I try to say around 100 square feet.
Wow.
All right. It's a good-sized painting. Well, when you have 250 figures, it's a lot to paint.
So you're satisfied with the way things worked this weekend? This was a unique experience for us. You've done it before.
Oh yeah, I'm delighted. I think y'all have been extremely impressed, I should say, with the intelligence level and knowledge level of the people who have come in.
Very much.
And I want to say again and again that they are giving their time because they feel it's valuable. Like I said, this is the third one that Jim's worked with me on. And Jerry and Walter, this is the second. And I'm amazed they'll still work with me, but it's nice to know that they think this is valuable enough to give their time.
And it was obvious. They were enjoying themselves from the moment they got on their knees yesterday at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning until we finished the program today. It'll turn out that we'll have 3 two-hour programs to present to our audience, and that's kind of neat too, because like you, we're interested in generating a passion for history here in the North Country, and hopefully by September 11th next year, and each September 11th, we'll have this thing at a fever pitch before we know it.
Well, Gordy, you have made a historic document that people are going to watch generations from now and use as a research base to say, my goodness, because you have picked up, by coming in and doing all this incredible work you've done, you have picked up the dialogue, you've picked up the comments that have made that consensus possible. As important as this finished discussion is today, I think you were picking up on the synergy yesterday between the discussions about distance, time, and the physical elements involved, and how they relate to make this pattern fit. That fits. I feel that fits like a glove over there. I really do.
I know you do. You were really satisfied with the way that came out.
About 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, it was like, there it was. I mean, everything worked out, all the distances, all the disparate and what seemingly differential information came together.
The amazing part of it is that was done at that moment, and all the historians previous to that were never quite sure. Or they may have thought they were, but we think we got it pretty close to right on the nose.
Nobody's ever done this process before.
Yeah.
And there have been war games, and there have people who have come together and given papers at conferences, and you've had some discussions. But as far as doing this, and literally taking hours where the best people can get together and do it, I think nets a product that's completely unique.
When you started doing this, was this an idea you conceived in the middle of the night, or
No.
how did this all evolve in the beginning for you?
Well, I live on Mobile Bay, and in doing the Battle of Mobile Bay, I had some questions, and so I started to read and get some ideas, and I pretty early found out that all their historical paintings and all of the lithographs and things weren't accurate. And so I said, well, do I want to use those as a basis for painting, or do I need to just throw it all out and go back down to the basics? So I built models of all the ships, and I got with the finest scholar in the world on the Mobile Bay who lived near me. And I said, look, it's not done till you say it's done. and let's work together. And he gave hundreds of hours, and we went in and we photographed, and we did this in miniature. The first one I did for Mobile Bay was much smaller in scope. And after I got the light figured out and all that, I said, well, I got to get reenactors. I might as well do it. So I built a bulwarks, and if you look at it, I've got photographs, but it's much cruder. I took a carpet dowel with a roller on it and set it on it for them to use as a cannon, and did that, and those guys just worked their hearts out for me. And I did the painting, and when I got done, I got a tremendous amount of response from it. And while I was doing that, I thought, well, damn the torpedoes full speed ahead. Everybody knows, but nobody knows the real story. And then what about I've not yet begun to fight? What about we have met the enemy and they are ours? What about a signal victory? What about all these apothegms that have made history? And I found they all came down to a moment. And so with Farragut at Mobile Bay, I chose the minute. With John Paul Jones, down to the minute. With Perry, down to the minute. Each one got more complicated than the next one. And this is the mother of all reenactments for me. The Lake Erie covered nearly this much space, about 2/3 this space, but it was a running battle. And we only needed one scale and no land mass at all. I mean, land is 5 miles away. To do this, I knew it was going to require, you've got to get the bay, you've got to get the action. And then I thought, well, but at this scale, it just won't work if we do these 96th. So 1/96 scale. So I said, how do we do this? And so I came up with the idea of building the smaller models for the overview, just like I do the paintings, and then the bigger models to get right in on the action. And I'm glad I did, because when we laid that out, we've even gotten some further refinements on this one. Yeah. So that's how it, came to be. You do what you have to do to make it right.
Isn't that the way? That's our credo. All this and the guy's left-handed. That's
we're the only ones in our right mind, so remember that.
Dean, thanks so much for coming to town and for what you've added to this group.
Thank you.
We can't wait to see the finished product.
God bless you. Let me see it when it's done, if you would.
Bet we will. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.